I don't know, we have sort of expectations, and sometimes I think people are afraid to come to church because they are afraid of, they don't want to have a lot of duties and obligations loaded onto them. I heard someone say something I thought was very good one time, that if you go to church and you leave with a list of things to do, you probably haven't heard the gospel. But if you leave with some things to believe, you've probably heard the gospel. And so what I would like to do today is let you relax a little bit and rest, and I'm not going to ask you to do anything. I just want to give you some things to believe and just to talk about Jesus and what He's done for us. See, what I think people have in their sort of religious part of their minds and their expectation is that what we get when we come to church is things we need to do for God. But the gospel is not about things you need to do for God. It's things God has done for you through Christ. I had an experience that sort of changed my perspective on things some years ago. Before I ever started this church, we had our prison ministry, and I went out on Thursday nights with a man named Merlin Booty, who some of you know, and who's gone to be with the Lord now. But at that time, we were showing videotapes by a man named Casey Treat. Have you heard of him? You know who he is? And we had a set of videotapes called Renewing the Mind. And I thought these were really good, and so we would show these based on Romans chapter 12, verse 2, where Paul said, "Be transformed by the renewing of your mind." And I was really sort of focused on that. And then after we finished the videotapes, I just continued, and I would go out, and every week I'd say, "You men," I wanted their lives to be changed, you see. And I said, "You men, you need to renew your minds." And Romans 12:2 says, "You need to renew your minds." And every week, "You men need to renew your minds." And one week, as I was driving out to tell them they needed to renew their minds, I was praying about the service in the car, and I'm driving along. And, did you know that the Lord can speak to us in a way that He can get across to us when He needs to? He can get a message to us when it's necessary. Now, if you don't feel like you're getting direct messages, in a way that you're sure it's the Lord speaking, many times it's very subtle, He just leads us. And I think that's the general way that the Lord leads us, in a very subtle way, not by, Usually when I get something I say, the Lord spoke to me, usually it's along the line of correction. And so don't feel bad, because this was sort of a correction to me. And I was driving, and in my mind I was thinking to myself, I'm going to go tell them they need to renew their minds. And I'm praying about the service. And the Lord spoke to me, and really I knew it was the Lord speaking to me, because it changed, it wasn't what was on my mind. And here's what He said. He said, "Why don't you just give them a message that will renew their minds instead of telling, then you won't have to tell them to renew their minds." And that was a new thought to me. Why don't you just give them a message that will renew their minds rather than just telling them to renew their minds? Then you won't have to tell them, it'll work automatically. And see, I think many times it's like that with faith. We encourage people to believe. You need to believe. You need to believe. You need to believe. But I think what's more effective sometimes is if we can present a message to believe, and a message about what God has done for us. Then faith is a natural response to the grace of God and the gospel. So what I want to do this morning is talk about some things to believe. Some things about redemption. Oh, and by the way, I found something good. I always say, if you have anything good, let me read you something I found that I thought, I like this. This is a book that I have by a man named J.B. Phillips. And this man, J.B. Phillips, translated the Bible, made a New Testament translation into modern English called the Phillips Translation. You might have heard of that. And he wrote this book. These are sort of messages that were inspired by his translating of the Bible and looking into various words. And when he was looking at the word believe and all of the various ways it's used in the Bible, he had this to say. And I think this is good. I wanted to give you this. Since I'm talking about, I want to give you something to believe. He says, it means a real revolution in a person's thinking when he realizes that what he could never do for himself has already been done. He need no longer try and put up a case or try to justify himself before God, which is hopeless anyway. All he has to do, according to the New Testament, is to transfer his central confidence in his own goodness and abilities to Christ, who is the Son of God and our representative man. That is what the New Testament writers mean by faith. I thought that was good. What he wants us to do is to transfer our confidence from ourselves to Jesus. Now, that's easier to say sometimes than to do, because we tend to want to rely upon ourselves. But I thought that was good. So what I want to do is give you some information and talk about some things about Jesus and redemption. And the theme I want to pursue today is this. And if you want to turn to Hebrews chapter 1, verse 1, I want to start there. I want to talk about redemption, God's one-man show. Now, I don't mean that to be disrespectful or irreverent by saying one-man show. I mean by that, when you see a performer, when he performs and does everything himself, then we call that a one-man show. Sometimes there's a guy that dresses up like Mark Twain, and he goes out and he says things that Mark Twain said, and we call that a one-man show. What that means is there's nobody helping him. He's doing it all himself. And what I'd like to suggest is that redemption is something that God does all himself. He's done, and there's a lot of scriptures that tell us that. Well, what does that leave us to do? Well, what we're supposed to do is put our faith in that and believe in what He has done for us. You see, I think unless you look at it that way, you get the idea in mind that we do things and twist God's arm and try to convince Him to act in response to us. But really the truth is God's already acted on our behalf. He's already done something for us, and the big thing He did for us was to send Jesus to the cross to reconcile us to Himself. Now, He didn't do that in response to somebody twisting His arm and pushing Him and making Him do it. He wanted to do it. It was all His idea, and that's what grace is. Hebrews chapter 1, verse 1 starts with God. God starts with Him because He's the initial motivator and the actor in this thing. God, who at sundry times and in divers manners spoke in times past unto the fathers by the prophets, hath in these last days spoken unto us by His Son, whom He hath appointed heir of all things, by whom also He made the worlds. Now, before we go further, let's just comment on those verses. He said, God in times past, meaning in the period of time in which the Old Testament writers, the prophets, did their work. God spoke in times past through all these various prophets. He spoke through Isaiah, He spoke through Ezekiel, He spoke to Daniel, and He spoke to Jeremiah, and He spoke through all of the different prophets in the Old Testament. But finally, He says He spoke to us by His Son. Distinguishing or identifying Jesus as, we might say, the culmination of God speaking to us in the most clear and direct way that God has spoken to us, and the one we need to really pay attention to. God has, in these last days, spoken unto us by His Son, and then He begins to talk about the Son, which is Jesus. He says, whom He hath appointed heir of all things, by whom also He made the worlds. Verse 3 says, still speaking of Jesus, who being the brightness of His glory, and the express image of His person, and still speaking of Jesus, and upholding all things by the word of His power. And notice this next phrase, this next expression. When He had by Himself purged our sins, He sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. Now, to me, the words that jump out to me, well, there's a lot of words that you could talk about, but today what jumps out at me is when He says that He by Himself purged our sins. Now, when it says by Himself, evidently that means He did it all by Himself. I mean, that's not too hard of an explanation, is it? When it says by Himself, that means He did it by Himself. Now, what's amazing about it is, and what requires us to get over some of our preconceptions, is that He says He purged our sins. See, we are the ones, He didn't sin, of course, but we are the ones who have committed sins, and the purging or the cleaning. By the way, I looked up the word purge in the dictionary. I'm a big one to look up words in the dictionary. Because we have a general idea of what things mean, but I find if we get a specific meaning, it makes this mean something specifically better. Webster's dictionary says to purge means to free from impurities. Now, did you ever consider the fact that Jesus freed us from impurities by Himself? We think, here's the way we think. We think that's something that we're supposed to do. Now, granted, what we're supposed to do is to believe in that. And do you believe that if you believe that Jesus has done this for you, it changes the way you live. It changes the way you relate to God. See, I think the reason this is in the Bible, the reason this is in this book of Hebrews, is the writer wants us to know the greatness and the magnitude of what has already been done for us. The word purge means to free from impurities, to remove impurities by cleansing, to rid of guilt, sin, or defilement, to clear of a charge or imputation, to become clean and pure,